All right. Um, so hi, everybody. My name's Jeff Fuad, and I'm presenting on work in a collaboration between Monmouth University and the Borough of Lake Como in New Jersey. And this is very much an extension of the last talk. So if you were here in the same track for the last talk with Heather Butts and Abraham Rodriguez, you noticed a theme in using technology for city planning, and that theme is very much extended here in this work. And this is the third and final in a series talking about mobilizing a town behind environmental initiatives and the use of computers in those initiatives. And so this particular presentation is on the use of geographic computing. And I was told to amp up the drone side of this because it looked like from the program, there's maybe only one other presenter talking about drones. And it's actually going on right now, so hopefully nobody jumps ship here and goes to the other drone presentation. But yeah, drones, I mean, we're hearing a lot about them in the news these days in terms of our weapon systems with events in Ukraine. We're not doing anything like that here. We're using them for scientific and planning applications. So we'll talk about the use of drones in Lake Como fairly extensively in this talk. And this is very much a retrospective, looking back on, it's hard to believe, John, that we've been doing this work since 2016. So six years now of this collaboration between Monmouth and Lake Como on various initiatives, all of which centered around using GIS and computer maps, underpinning the technologies and the planning that we make. All right, So Monmouth and Lake Como has been partnering since 2016. It was initiated by John. He came to Monmouth. I believe, John, you might have first talked to the Urban Coast Institute at Monmouth. And then, they said, hey, we have this new GIS professor. And then we met soon after that and started brainstorming on how we could incorporate the environmental initiatives of Lake Como in the GIS academic program at Monmouth University. It makes perfect sense, the partnership. We never really formalized anything. It was always just kind of, ad hoc on the fly, like, oh, we're doing this. How can we incorporate that into the GIS academics at Monmouth? And so the partnership makes perfect sense in terms of the location. Monmouth is just a short 9 miles from Lake Como itself. I have the biking directions here because that's actually how I get down there. I use my bike, and if I ever have to go down to Lake Como, I just hop on my bike and go down there. It's a beautiful trip down the shore. And so the initial work in 2016 was very much just gathering and developing baseline data about the town itself. Some of it municipal data about infrastructure, other data on the environmental assets of the community. And since then, it's really grown over time to having a focus on applying the drone that we have at Monmouth on some environmental questions that we'd like to answer regarding the town and the lake that it's named after. Lake Como itself is the lake to the south of the town. So the borough itself is distinctive in my mind for many of the reasons that John spoke about in his presentation this morning. And truthfully, the reason why all this is happening is John Gibbons. So I tip my cap to him in being such an innovator and bringing in a local university to give students that, to use Abraham's language from last talk, that work-based learning experience, which is very much what's happening as well at the university level and happening at the high school level with Mr. Rodriguez. Another element to Lake Como that's distinctive is its environmental commission. I mean, all these towns on the shore and many towns in New Jersey have environmental commissions. That in itself is not distinctive, but the group, when I've met with them, I've been so impressed by their forward thinking and being nimble, really being receptive to ideas and even proposing ideas of their own that then blossom into larger projects. The town itself is, I like to say, is small and nimble. The city council, it's not a large town, so you don't have to deal with a lot of bureaucratic red tape, and they're, receptive to these kind of new ideas, and even have new ideas of their own that we then pursue as well. The geography of the town is also distinctive. Like John mentioned this morning, it's a shore town without a shore, with all the shore problems, but no benefits of actually having a shoreline itself. They do have the lakefront though, and that is a focus of some of the work that we've done over time here. And but yeah, so it's a smaller town, less than about a quarter square mile, and so it's small. And that's really important when you're doing geographic computing in a GIS, because your GIS data sets can get very large, very quick. And what happens with that is longer processing times and a decrease in student engagement. So when computational problems become large and unwieldy, you'll notice students tend to shut down or basically disengage. And so what's great about Lake Como is even when you're working with dense data sets like, drone imagery, things that can get very large, because Lake Como is small, those file sizes still stay small and our processing times still stay relatively small as well. So it's a great little sandbox for students to learn GIS skills and geographic computing and not be bogged down by some of those more advanced issues of using larger data sets and accessing things like cloud computing and all that. We can avoid all those pitfalls of a larger study area. So the project started in 2016, and this is the academic year of 2016 and 2017, in a very basic phase of data development. So the town itself had some digitized maps of infrastructure, like this map that's shown here. This is a storm drainage plan map from an engineering firm, and I imagine I can't see a date, but I think it's from the 90s. And so it's older, and it needed to be not just scanned in that sense of digitizing, but it needed to be input into a GIS to actually make these plans operational from a computational perspective. So students did digitize the scanned map in a GIS. That process is known as georeferencing, where we can see quite plainly the intersections of the streets. And by seeing those known locations, we can kind of pin this map to a current map, like an aerial image. And then we can start to just basically hand draw the stormwater lines, as is the case in this map here. So that happened for a series of maps. We had like the sewer plan, we had the water distribution plan, that's like fire hydrants and things like that for emergency response. And so a student in fall of 2016, and I was to prepare for this, I was looking back at all this data, old data, and it was still sitting there under Cameron's file that I have. And so Cameron McMath was a student that developed this data in fall 2016. And then in spring, when the weather started to get better, we did have another student doing GPS work out in the field. They were a student who, I think they were the leader of the outdoor club at Monmouth. And so they were like really, wanting to get out in the field for field experience. So they did do some global position system mapping, a GPS mapping of assets in the community. And this map at the right is showing some environmental assets in terms of benches along the lakefront and trees along the lakefront as well. And they also went into the city and did some manhole mapping and some other, I think they did fire hydrants as well, just to update any of the old plans that might have changed over time. And so they did learn how to use a GPS in the field. And this actually gained that particular student, I believe, they got an internship for the New Jersey Forest Fire Service, just based on their GPS skills. And yeah, that student ended up developing, you know, and I do this a lot with my students. I invert the relationship and they begin to teach me about these technologies they're using. So if anybody's ever worked with a GPS unit, unfortunately, each is different. They have different procedures on how you design data inside of the unit itself. Nowadays, a lot of it has cloud. It's in the cloud. You upload a data dictionary, they call it, with a scheme for the data you're collecting. But back when we did this, it was still locally stored on the GPS itself. And the student designed one of these data dictionaries for collecting data in the field. And then they documented the use of the GPS. So that way, in future semesters, I could hand it off to another student and say, oh, here's this, here's this document that a previous student developed. And you can follow it to then use our Trimble GPS on campus. And we're going through that process right now, actually, with some archaeology students who are using our new GPS. And of course, it has a new procedure, and they're documenting it right now. I would say this work culminated, this kind of baseline data collection and development culminated in the academic year of 2017 to 2018 with an online municipal web map designed by our student Patrice Case. Patrice really took this data and ran with it and developed a fully interactive web map in the ArcGIS developer environment. So it combines, JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. The JavaScript API is really extensive in ArcGIS. So again, student became teacher, and Patrice started teaching me how to interact with that API and actually design this web map. And I was really happy to see it still living on Lake Como's website. So it's still there, it's still active, and we can, modify the code to input. I'm hoping you guys can see this new screen. If not, let me know. But yeah, this is the web map that Patrice designed. It was as a part of an independent study. So she basically, what her study was learning this pretty large and extensive API for designing web maps using ArcGIS. You can see this is all custom made. She has the layers listed at the side, and then you can interact with the map, zoom in, out, and I believe you can even. So she has the symbols kind of hard coded in, but you can see different layers. Let's see. The parcels, which I'll be talking about a little later in terms of how John wants to use those for mapping, yards of distinction that have good landscaping design. Yeah, so I think you can even click and yep, we got a pop-up box to give you information about that particular parcel, and then you could look it up in the state database, that kind of thing. Oops, not seeing the map.
No, it's there, don't worry.
Oh, okay, got it. Yeah, so this was one of my, when you're a teacher, you're doing like larger lectures and things can be a little less gratifying sometimes than working individually with students like this on these projects, where you really see a student develop. And Patrice went on to, she's now a GIS professional. She's working at a firm in New York. I'll get to that shortly here. Yeah, here it is. So So yeah, out of this data development phase of the work, we did have 2 students secure an internship with the New Jersey Forest Fire Service. That's extremely gratifying to see students getting, actual work and pay out of these projects. And then Patrice did go on to work professionally as a GIS analyst at the Monmouth County Sheriff's Office, and now she's currently at Rapid SOS, which is it's a emergency management GIS company, emergency management and response. And so yes, and I want to emphasize here too that we don't have a terminal degree in GIS. It's just a minor at the undergraduate level and a graduate certificate at the graduate level. So to see students going into actual professional work with it is, to me, that's the pinnacle of what I want to accomplish for our students. And so, and it's all made possible by this collaboration with Lake Como. So it's extremely important. So after this basic data development phase, we then shifted into scientific studies of the lake itself and of the town. And so our first study of this nature that was really based in some kind of scientific question, which is what gets me excited as a physical scientist, is the lake itself. And using, I know a lot of people think of drones in aerial format, but we also have a drone boat on campus. And you might think to yourself, well, why can't you just, use a regular old boat and take measurements of lake depth using that technology that we've been using for years and years. In the case of Lake Como, it's extremely shallow. And it's also somewhat of, it's a sensitive environment. You don't want to disturb the wildlife so much. I remember, I think the day that we went out there was like swans and things like that on the lake, and you really don't want to disturb what's going on in the lake. So the drone boat is extremely small. It's probably like 3 feet long and 2 feet wide. It doesn't make much noise. And so it's kind of agile and where it can get to. And so that is beneficial. And so in summer 2017, the Urban Coast Institute at Monmouth University, and you can see in the picture at the left is Jim Nichols, who's basically he's our field guru. He does everything in the field so well. And so Jim used the drone boat from UCI, Urban Coast Institute, and conducted this survey of Lake Como, measuring depths at pretty dense short intervals, so we could then construct a bathymetric map or surface of the bottom of the lake. And the whole purpose of this is it's twofold, and I think it might be in this slide here, yes, is to basically inform any dredging activity that might occur in the lake, right? So we have all this urban landscape surrounding the lake itself, with impervious surfaces draining to the lake, bringing in sediments into the lake and infilling the lake over time. So we do know that over time, the lake has gotten shallower due to infilling sediments, and eventually it may need to be dredged. I'm not sure historically when it's been dredged. And so a study like this, constructing a bathymetric map of the lake, can be used to tell a dredging company where to dredge, so where is it shallowest, where is it being infilled with sediments. And if you can do this repeatedly too over time, you can then schedule the dredging as well. And so that's something that we were interested in this work. There was also another motivation in terms of designing a course around this idea of repeat measurements of lake depth and repeatedly creating a bathymetric surface of the bottom of the lake over time to then inform any kind of dredging activities. Is dredging needed? Is there infilling of the lake? And so you can do this 2 ways. You can use the fancy drone boat, which not to, obviously it's awesome technology, but it's $25,000 total, so it's not accessible in terms of the finances to all programs. It's also, it's expensive equipment for an undergrad student to use in a course, so it's probably not ideal for that situation. We'd probably have Jim coming back out every summer, and to engage with his time every summer would be a challenge, right? Because he's on other projects. And so my thoughts were to go low tech and old school and just attach a GPS like you see to a kayak, and you just take point measurements, every say 50 meters or so. This idea came from work actually that I did down in Florida when we did bathymetric surfaces of wetlands, right? So wetlands are an extremely difficult environment to map their depth and storage capacity because they have vegetation and they're filled with water in a lot of cases. So I was contracted by the U.S. Geological Survey to do bathymetric maps of wetlands back in like 2008. And that's really what we did, was just with a total station, went out in the field and just did point measurements every 50 meters or so. And then you can use those measurements to then construct your surface. And this type of technology, the kayak, has been used in reservoir studies, studying the infilling of reservoirs. So it's a cheaper alternative, and it's one that our students can interact with. Our students, we could get a kayak, get a GPS attached to that kayak, and then they could just drop like a tape measure with like a secchi depth kind of thing, and take the depths at different points. And so those were the two competing ideas. And if we're to design a course, we want to make sure that cheaper alternative is feasible. And so so the hypothesis we were testing in this study was we have this extremely dense bathymetric map from the drone, but can we start to use fewer measurements from that survey to simulate, say, your kayak survey, and see if you get similar results? Like, you don't really need that drone survey. So the rationale behind that hypothesis is looking back at, I can't remember when this map, it's from the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. I believe it's from like the 70s or 80s. And you can see from this map that the lake is shallow. It averages depth of about 3 feet. And so the 3-foot contour interval is like this big area right here. This big area right here. So most of the depths right here are around, if the average is 3 feet, this is your 3-foot depth contour interval. Most of the lake is about 3 feet deep. So it's basically like a bucket. It's not really, doesn't really have too much variation in depth until you get to this one little spot over here. That's probably just being scoured by the inflows. So the thought was, if this is just a flat bottom lake, then yeah, let's just try to see if we can prune the measurements we have, make them smaller and fewer, and see if we get similar results. And so we took our survey, which had 6,276 measurements from the drone boat. This is Jim's image here from the transects that he designed in his little pad. I think it was like a little iPad thing. And so he just did a transect. I think it was like every 75 meters or so. And the boat would just follow this automatically. We didn't even, we obviously kept an eye on it as it was going, but it took probably about an hour or two once it got going to get all this data. And I guess it kind of petered out over here. We didn't get measurements near the inflow. I guess I'll pose a question before the question and answer period. Can anybody think of what happened over here, why we could get this stuff? So the drone boat got a little lost in the weeds. There's some aquatic vegetation and it got tangled up in the propeller. And so it got stopped by this, because we were doing it in the summer. So the underwater vegetation was really blooming. And so we would probably have to do this, now that we know this, we'd probably have to do this in the winter in the future if we're going to use the drone boat for this purpose. But yeah, so from here, the study design was to simulate a kayak survey. So we took our measurements from the drone and gradually pruned them to make them fewer and fewer to see how they would compare with the drone survey. So we started, with having one random measurement every 20 meters, then 40 meters. And so you can see as you take those measurements at larger intervals, you get fewer and fewer measurements. So like this one at the left is every 20 meters and you have 295 measurements. And then this map at the right is every 40 meters and you have just 94 measurements. And then 60 is only 45 measurements. So you could do that. And I remember we used to do that kind of work in the course of an afternoon in a wetland of a similar size as the lake. So no problem then. All right, so we then compared our drone survey to storage estimates of the lake based on a bathymetric surface, that one that you're kind of looking at here. It's a three-dimensional surface of depth, right? And if you just make a flat line on top of that surface, then you can get storage estimates, so the volume of the lake. And as you're pruning out those measurements, getting fewer and fewer, you just estimate storage, and you compare that storage estimate to the one from the drone survey. And so what we found was really, and I should mention too, that we get these confidence intervals, these bars here in this plot, is from repeating that random process 100 times. And so you can get then a range of certainty of how different your storage estimates are compared to the drone survey. And we can see that, you don't really get much difference if you're doing it every 20 meters here. And that was that one that's like 300 measurements in the lake. So that one's pretty effective, right? But if you don't, 300 measurements is a lot to collect in a kayak. And so if you don't want to do that, so what are we gaining from, or what's different if we just go to 40 meters, which is like the 94? Well, it's only 3% different from, or no, it's only 2% different from the drone survey. So doing pretty well. And then finally at 60 meters, where you have 45 measurements, you're still within the range of certainty of that 40-meter survey. And you only have 45 measurements, and you're still doing pretty good. You're about 4% different from the drone survey. So in my mind, that's pretty effective way to calculate storage and get students involved in the process too, because they can go out in a kayak and do it. So got to get around to designing this course. I know it's been a few years, kind of got pulled in other directions in terms of course development, but I still do want to design a field course in doing this every summer at the lake, get some funding for a kayak and the GPS unit. And in the process, then students will gain this marketable skill. I already said that I had a job in doing this very thing. And some experiential education credit for graduation, and again, some work-based service learning. So I'm going to shift focus now to the town and using aerial technologies. We are going to be shifting focus to what is draining to the lake, because that is very much influencing the water quality of the lake. And so there is a program on Monmouth's campus called CLONET, and they do water quality monitoring of all the coastal lakes in Monmouth County, including Lake Como. And what I learned from Jason Adolph, the professor who operates or directs that program, is Lake Como has been spared from harmful algal blooms, but many of these lakes in Monmouth County are subject to harmful algal blooms, and these are just basically toxic events where you can't use the lake. You have to be aware of what's going on, because it could actually harm pets in the area, and it can harm humans as well. So Lake Como has been spared of that over time. And so what I want, the hypothesis here is that what's different about Lake Como in terms of the other lakes that are having harmful algal blooms, and we want to map the impervious surfaces that could be carrying nutrients to the lake and contributing to those harmful algal blooms. And you can see on the ground, John Gibbons, I believe Heather Butts is here as well in this picture. You guys are very aware of this problem, and operationally on the ground, how do we try to prevent it? Well, we try to change impervious surfaces to pervious surfaces that let water percolate into the ground. And so you can see that a rain garden being planted at the Borough Hall to try to, circumvent some of this runoff draining to the lake. And so that's kind of like on the ground what we can do with the type of information I'm about to show you. So this is an example of some adaptive course design. I was on a grant for NASA EONS. I forget all these abbreviations, but basically it's a NASA workforce development grant, and we were working with middle and high school students in the fall of 2020. It was 12 Saturdays. So first off, Saturdays are rough, but actually in my experience doing these Saturday workshops in person were perfectly fine. They were very productive. It was when we had to transition to Zoom due to the pandemic that they kind of went off the rails. Middle school and high school students were already on Zoom, for the week, during the week. These are New York City students, so they were zoomed out. And what we were experiencing was each Saturday we were going to have just like a different lab exercise where they analyze some satellite imagery in some different context. So it'd be like a different thing every Saturday. And I was very early on, I realized this was not going to work. They were not engaged with just kind of like learning about different satellite technology. So I said, okay, let's apply some continuity to each Saturday and work on one single project. And so in this case, I proposed to the project lead that we shift the workshop into studying impervious surfaces and mapping them in Lake Como. And so what we did was we just worked with one image, right? And we had 20 or so students working on that one image. I think this is from 2019. And so you take this aerial image with its bands of red, green, blue, and near infrared energy, and you can classify it based on those bands of energy into what you see at the right, where you can see that we've broken down that aerial image into different classes. The grays are impervious, the greens are pervious surfaces. So like our eyes, the map at the left, our eyes can identify those different surfaces. We can say, oh, there's a green tree, and that's probably like an impervious, or a pervious area, and then there's a street, that's an impervious surface. But what you have to do in order, you don't want to map that manually, that would be really painstaking, even for a smaller area like this. So just like our eyes are trained to see these surfaces, we can train a computer to see these surfaces as well based on those different bands in the image. And so so what the students did started out just by, just the conceptual design of this is basically what surfaces are there in the image, and first map out some samples of those surfaces. These are called training samples. And then based on those training samples, you can apply a classifier to cluster or group the image into different classes. And so what you see here is just a training sample where a student has drawn, the crown of a tree, the top of a roof, some, rectangular objects on the street, identifying the asphalt. And then you can train the computer to classify the entire image based on that training sample. And what comes out of this are a series of maps. So you have one map from student A, another map from student B, and you can see there's variations in these maps. Like the one on the right here has a lot more pervious green classes, and the one on the left has a lot more impervious gray classes. But you can get an average out of that, right? It's kind of like an ensemble approach, and probably some of our climate people today have been talking about ensemble models, where you kind of use different models to get some average, and that's actually your estimate. And so that's what we did here. And in the end, I had a small sample to work with. Again, it was challenged. So yeah, this also was remote computing. They were accessing the software on Amazon AppStream, and Amazon AppStream was not cooperating for some Saturdays. But The results were that we found that Lake Como is covered in about 51% impervious surfaces. This is just one sample of a map from a student where you see your grays basically follow the streets, right? And the rooftops in town. So those are all impervious. And then you have your greens, which are following. Oftentimes you can see the yards cut out around the homes and trees, crowns of trees, and you can see parks down here. And so, yeah, so overall, it was a, once we made that adaptation to the workshop design, it was pretty successful. And we ended up having a nice meeting with this borough council. Kevin Higgins is the mayor, and these students that are one middle school student, Zayden, and one high school student, Shriwashi, presented their findings to the city council. I mean, amazingly brave students. I could never envision doing that at that age at a city council meeting. It's like, just like what Abraham's doing with the students at Williamsburg. It's like, this experience is transformative, for lack of a better word. And so moving on to, all right, so we can map the surfaces, but those surfaces don't really matter if they're not draining to the lake. And so the next phase of the project was this past summer, we had a student awarded a summer scholars appointment at Monmouth. And so they were paid a stipend and given housing, which is pretty nice because, Monmouth's close to the shore. So you got your free summer housing at the shore. And what we wanted to do was actually use the drone, an aerial drone this time, to fly over town, map the impervious surfaces at a very high resolution, much higher than the image that I was just showing you. But also from that, develop a three-dimensional model of the town. And from that 3D model, we can then see the drainage paths to the lake and which ones are impervious and which ones are pervious. And so, of course, if you have a drainage path that is impervious, it's basically carrying all that water to the lake, and it's more problematic for the quality of the water in the lake. I think I have a video. I'm not sure. Hopefully this will work. Let me see. I might have to exit this. It's just the drone in action. If anybody's never seen one, it's and this was all pre-programmed. It was a pre-programmed flight that Mia designed on an app on her phone. Simple as that. So I'm going to try and bring up this copy. Oops, sorry. Bring over another screen. Oh, didn't take that. Okay. So this is just I think John did this video. So made the rounds on the internet a little bit. Of course, we have the advertisement. But yeah, so this is just, her phone is attached to the drone, and it has a pre-programmed flight, and then it goes on up and it goes to a specific altitude above the town and takes images in a series along transect lines, very similar to that boat, the way the boat operated before. It was a foggier day, unfortunately, but the images still turned out, they were hazy, but they still turned out okay. They were good enough to use, at least. And so I'm back on the slideshow. Let me know if it's not reverted back to that. So basically what happens here is it's an old school approach from the 40s and 30s, photogrammetry, where you have a series of images with an overlap, and the fact that they're looking at the same general area at different angles, you can then estimate depth or relief from these images taken at different angles. What the drone does, it's like photogrammetry on steroids, because it used to just be we take two images that are kind of partially overlapping, and then we just develop a terrain map from that. But what we have here is like 100 images, and so it uses this new approach called structure from motion to develop a point cloud of depth that's shown here in the middle, and then from those points, we just connect the dots basically and create a surface model, which is our three-dimensional model. And then, so based on the three-dimensional model, there's some standard tools in GIS that we can use to map the drainage paths to the lake. So you can actually see in this map here, these blue lines are the way the water drains to the lake, and they're primarily on our roads. That's by design, that's engineering design. So it's not surprising, but what's cool about this is it's an automated process. I used to do stormwater modeling, and we would have to do this by hand, and it was really painful. So now we have the drone to do this in an automated fashion with greater detail too. I mean, these are really highly resolved maps here, less than a meter resolution on the ground. And then the map at the right that you see are the drainage paths broken down by their type of surface. So are they pervious, like are they vegetation, or are they bare ground, or are they impervious? And what we found was about half of the drainage paths are covered in your impervious surfaces. Not surprising, because they're just following the roads and draining off to the lake overland. That's by design, right? And so with that finding, then you can start to make recommendations, because you now have that concrete evidence of what's contributing runoff to the lake. And so, just like John presented before, you can start to make some changes to those surfaces where, you could alter street design by placing or installing pervious surfaces right next to the gutter, by the curb. This is actually a design from the American Institute of Architects. So I'm very much not in the design world, but this kind of like scientific study can inform your designs, because now you have that concrete evidence of where the water is draining and what surfaces it's draining over. And so let's see, I don't want to use my entire time talking, so I think I'm about to wrap. So next up, and this might be news to John and the rest of the group, is we did secure another summer scholars for this summer of 2022. We'll be having an international student in our Homeland Security program who's really interested in natural hazards, starting to map buildings in areas that flooded during Sandy to make to conduct a damage assessment basically from Sandy, and do that using the drone. So fly the drone over town again, and actually map out where the buildings are and their height above the lake. And then that height could then be used to estimate if it would flood under future scenarios or a previous one like Sandy, for the purpose of validation, to seeing if our approach is actually working or not. You can see we already have building footprints. This is actually a Microsoft product. They have building footprints for the whole North America. But there's errors. Like you can see, there's buildings where there's actually not any buildings, and some of the orientation of them are incorrect. So having a drone do that work would hopefully improve the accuracy of the building footprints. So that's what we plan to do this summer, by way of that Summer Scholars Program. And then on the right is something that I still need to do for John. We need to get a student, or I can just do it because it probably wouldn't take me but a day, but basically start to input data from John's program for the Patchwork for Wildlife. And so John's been awarding these different yards at different levels of, how well they're landscaping in terms of their ecological impact. Giving them awards, and then actually inputting that into a GIS. And that could actually be a layer that's in the web map for town. So people would be acknowledged by John's group, and then could go online and say, hey, look at my yard with this award online. And so that's kind of our direction moving forward. And yeah, that's my time. I think they just a bit of 5-10 minutes for questions, hopefully, discussion, and a beautiful picture of Lake Como at the shore.
Yeah, we have about 10 minutes left. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to just unmute and speak, or you can put them in the chat and we'll read them from there. But regardless, thank you, Jeff. That was really cool to see all these different projects and people getting involved with this sort of data collection and analysis.
Thanks, Shane. Yeah, it's great to get students in these in-depth projects. Yeah. And while we're thinking of any questions, I'll just go ahead and thank, people involved in these projects. It's definitely not, I'm rare. I mean, I'd like to get into the computing of it all, but I just have too many other projects ongoing. And so this really is a work of the students listed at the right. Since 2016, these have been the most active students in the program. And then, of course, thanks to John, Heather, and Abraham for kind of making this a really cohesive, dynamic project that I, could never have developed on my own. And also thanks to our, Shane and Nia for operating Zoom here, and thanks to all the TCF organizers. It's been a great day. Looks like we got something in the chat. Oh yeah, I know it's recording, right?
Yeah, so in probably a few days to maybe like a week or so, we're gonna make these recordings available, so you'll be able to view them and share them again.
That's great.
Yeah. I actually had a question about the like storage measurement for the lake.
Mm-hmm.
So wouldn't you run into the issue of the more measurements you take, the higher value you're gonna get? So I'm equating it to when you're measuring a coastline, the more closer the points you measure, the more distance you'll actually get. Did you notice a similar phenomenon there where if your points were more dense, you would just hit measurements you couldn't see with lower resolutions?
That's a good point. Because I was just looking at percent difference, right? So I wasn't looking at if the storage estimates were larger or smaller as you're thinning. That's a good question. I would have to go back into that data and see if, as you're thinning, are your estimates getting smaller or larger. But yeah, I would imagine that might be the case. That it's probably going in one direction or the other.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So yeah, I got a question from Susan. Lake Como breach during hurricane. It was actually. So this let's see if I can go backwards. So this map here actually does show the flooding from the gray area is the flooding from Sandy. And people on the ground probably would have corrections to this data, right? So the gray, I believe, was mapped by a post aerial image survey. So NOAA flew a plane, every day for a week after the storm. And from that imagery, you can basically see where there's flooding, because the flooding basically follows certain streets. And again, that's really by design, right? And so then you have somebody just hand digitize this area of flooding around the lake. And so it did extend, but there could be corrections to this where somebody be like, that's my house, it didn't flood, so there's obviously things that could be corrected. And that's kind of what we want to do with a more precise survey, a higher resolution survey using a drone. Because what the drone can do is what the drone can do that an aerial image cannot is it can also estimate the base height of the house. So you have a rooftop height. And what you can do nowadays with these algorithms that are pretty much standard in a lot of GIS software is you have the rooftop height, and then you can estimate the bottom of the building just based on the slope. All of a sudden, there's this steep slope falling off the roof, and then that next measurement next to that steep slope is your base foundational height of the building. So that's what we're going to be doing this summer, is kind of getting those base heights of the buildings, and then comparing that to different flood heights, and making some damage estimates. Yeah. Oh, yeah, Susan, that's a great question. So basically the question's about land surveyors having databases of elevation, and it's all public record because you need to go through a permitting office. And I have a master's student right now working in Monmouth County, collecting all the permits of elevated buildings that have been elevated since Sandy. So this master student she's nearly done, but the work is painstaking because you have to go to each municipality. Each municipality has a permitting office, and then that permitting office tells you if a building has been elevated or not. So we're getting the elevated ones. We're not getting the base heights of homes that haven't been modified. So the question there is really all about environmental justice and who's able to elevate and who's not. And so that's the framework of that project that we're working on. But yeah, if you haven't gone to the permitting office, then yeah, it would be private. You wouldn't know. But there has been work by Rutgers. They took a LiDAR device, one of these lasers, kind of like similar to like Google Earth does when you go to the street view, and they had a sensor atop a car or a truck, and they shot the base heights of a neighborhood. I can't remember where they did this, but basically they tried to automate the process by driving in a neighborhood and having a LiDAR laser trying to measure the heights of foundations in the neighborhood. So doing it's not as accurate as like a traditional land survey, but it's something you can get a lot of data really quick. Like a lot of these technologies are all about getting more data that might be less accurate, but it gives you a larger footprint of the data itself. Yeah, it's a great question. So John had a question too. I'll go back. I guess John's asking about the possibilities of creating a total map picture of the town. What would be included in basically this cohesive style of map. And I would say it would have layers going from underground utilities to above the ground, right? Like maybe even estimates of rainfall and things like that. And that's something that even a place like New York doesn't have. I mean, I was talking to somebody after 9/11, one of the side effects of that was the Port Authority lost all their blueprints to all buildings, all city planning, facilities that they had because of the attack. And we actually don't have that data. So yeah, total map is a major undertaking. And that's one that's in the future, what cities really need is data on where their infrastructure is and what's out there so they don't disturb it, or what's needed in certain areas. So yeah, that's kind of the wave of the future. And a lot of that will come with like these augmented reality technologies where you have a phone in the field and you're just kind of taking images, and those images can be processed in a way to automate the data collection.
Yeah, Jeff, the part what was interesting me was the fact that you said if you choose a small area, and that's why we're all doing this, because Lake Como, the town, is small, so you have a chance to do things in many different areas. And with the GIS area, I was wondering just how much a small town can enable you to do more things, especially given the amount of data that you've got to collect and so on. And if you get any closer to being able to make some really good advances in developing the map because of the smallness of the town, I just can't really get a handle on that myself.
Yeah, I mean, so you might notice in these maps that I'm showing right now that they're not the whole town. It's just like it's basically following 3 streets that drain to the lake. And this was actually because we ran into limitations of computational power when we were stitching the drone imagery together. Mia and I, we only had access to a 4 gigabyte, RAM memory computer for this work. So we couldn't get any bigger than what you're looking at. We now have a 32 gigabyte processor on campus that we're going to use to stitch together all those images. So even like that's how high resolution the drone stuff is that even in a small town like Lake Como, we still failed. We still couldn't quite do the whole town without some special computing hardware. So yeah, Lake Como allows us to do a lot, but you can even see now that we're getting all this drone technology stuff and the data is so dense that we're still even with Lake Como being so small, we're still kind of hitting some limits to what we can do. But yeah, we hope to get that image stitch. I have a software engineering group. They're automating the process now. It's gonna be like a pipeline, and they're using like 32 gigabyte memory chip on a server, and we'll get that running. And that's what our student this summer will use too. But yeah, I mean, Lake Como itself, though, in terms of the GIS data, if it's not drone stuff, we can do so much. I mean, it's because it's a smaller area.
All right, I'm gonna cut you off there. Thank you so much, Jeff. This is super cool to hear about all these projects, and I wish you luck with any future work that you do with your team.
Thanks, Shane.
And
Thanks, everybody.
so now in about 10 minutes, we're going to have